price tag is running higher for getting the MBTA back on track. The new estimate from the Fiscal and Management Control Board says the cost of fixing the current system will be more than $7 billion, and the board calls the gap between revenue and expenses unsustainable. To tell us about the report is the T's Chief Administrator, Brian Shortsleeve. Thank you very much for being with us, Brian.
Well, Chris, thanks for having me today. It's nice to be here.
Before we go down that road too far, talk about the winter ahead of us. How's it going to be different? Assuming we have pretty much the same weather, how much better will the T be?
Well, I can tell you this. The team at the T on the operations side has been working extremely hard to be ready for this winter, installing new rail, new heating systems, working on the communication strategy to communicate with customers, and that's the core subway system as well as the commuter rail. We had a nice event with Governor Baker this week in which Frank DePaula kind of walked through that plan in a lot of detail. And we're confident that the organization is more prepared than it's ever been for a tough winter.
Well, a lot of that work has been on the red line and the orange line. So what's so important about that as far as the winter?
Well, I think based on last winter, the work that's been done of late is really focused on the areas last winter where we had the most problems. That includes commuter rail. So there's a lot of work on the orange line, the red line, and the commuter rail. Well, the focus on parts of the system last winter that failed.
Especially the third rails, right?
That's right. And if you had an opportunity to see the event this week, we've got shiny new third rail going in, and it's amazing when you look at what it's replacing. In some cases, is rail that's 30, 40 years old. So you can really see the difference when you look at the quality of the new rail going in.
Well, the other problem was the way you got the power to the trains. Is that going to be any different?
They've done a lot of work on the power systems, and certainly one of the issues they're addressing with the rail are heating systems that enable the rails to run through colder weather and keep the power flowing. So there's been a lot of investment in the power side of things.
Well, turning to what's coming down the road, that figure keeps getting higher for what you got to do just to get the T we have now in working order. And the figure is so big. I'm saying, are you ever going to catch up in that?
Well, it's a good question. And the control board has worked extremely hard over the past 7 weeks to try to quantify that number. We refer to it as a state of good repair backlog, and what that number captures is the amount of money we would have to invest to get all of the systems, the revenue vehicles, the power systems, the tracks up to a level of good repair. From an annual standpoint, to keep the state of good repair backlog where it is requires about $500 million a year of spending. To significantly work it down requires $750. So one of the things that we're doing with the control board between now and December is prioritizing within that $7.3 billion what we think are the most impactful investments that will have the most immediate effect on the riders, and we're going to be putting those together and proposing a set of those investments for next year.
Talk about that gap between revenue and expenses. I mean, unsustainable is a strong word, so how bad is this? Well,
I think you have to start when you look at the operating budget with where we've been. Over the last 2 fiscal years, operating expenses of the T grew by almost 14%. In real dollar values, it's almost $200 million of increased operating expense at the T between fiscal 13 and fiscal 15. And to put that in perspective, that's over 2 years when ridership didn't grow and revenue didn't grow. So as long as your operating expenses are growing at a rate far greater than your revenues, the structural deficit will continue to grow. What we have done with the control board is looked at kind of a baseline pro forma, which I'd call a status quo projection. That's before any reform on the cost side and before we make progress on other sources of revenue like advertising and real estate that we're working very hard on. But it's a tough picture, and what we're going to be doing between now and December is coming up with a set of ideas, both in terms of own source revenue as well as cost control and cost reduction, that will enable us to bend those two lines together so that over the next 4 years, from an operating standpoint, we can reduce that structural deficit.
I imagine this gap must reflect, in part, some of the fiscal baggage that she's had for a long time. I mean, the big D debt.
Sure.
You've got operating expenses that were being paid out of the capital budget. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, if you look at our total expenses, it's about $2.1 billion. Of that, $1.6 billion is operating expenses. Another $500 million or so is debt service. And certainly on the debt service side, $140 million or so a year is debt that T owes, kind of legacy debt from the big dig, the central artery, in the beginning of forward funding. So those are contractual payments. It's something that that we've got to we've got to deal with. On the operating expense side, our strategy is going to be to focus very hard on efficiency and make sure that we're really sharpening our pencils as an organization and looking at where we spend every dollar, not only internally, but the MBTA buys lots of things from outside vendors. We've got lots of outside parties that provide services and goods, and we're looking at everything we do with a focus on where we can save money to try to invest that savings in a better rider experience to make sure the T runs more effectively.
Well, the report from the control board is certainly putting a spotlight on people not coming to work on the T. Some of that is justifiable and some of it isn't. So how are you going to draw the line better between those two?
Absenteeism is a very serious issue at the T, and that was covered pretty extensively in the Governor's Commission report from the summer and in the Fiscal Management Control Board as laid out. Filling absent positions costs the T about $14 million a year in overtime. So I think at the end, we got to start with strong management. So, what we're doing in that front is we're hiring a leave manager to organize our leave policy. We've engaged with an outside firm to help us better organize ourselves there. We're going to do an audit of FMLA, which is the Family Medical Leave Act, to make sure that all the folks that are participating in that program are eligible. And we're working very closely with the unions. We've had a very open dialogue with our unions about the importance of reducing absenteeism and in so doing, hopefully significantly reducing our overtime bill. Our total overtime bill last year was $53 million. So we think there's a real opportunity there.
Well, overtime could also in part reflect some staff shortages.
That's right.
Too.
That's right.
So what about that?
Well, about $4 million of it is to cover vacant positions. And one of the things we're looking very hard at right now, particularly on the transportation side of the T, which are the folks who drive the vehicles and sit in the stations, is whether we need to kind of increase staffing there to get those vacancy levels down and try to focus our scarce resources on the rider-facing side of things, which would be the transportation piece.
Another question, and this is getting into the big picture down the road, but we just had a meeting in Boston this week about somebody who wants to put up transit-oriented housing in Reeville. And people say, we're just not buying it because people won't get on the trains here. The service isn't good enough. I mean, it looks to me like, there are people out there saying, you got to have better service, you got to make it more affordable. I mean, can people have that?
Well, one of the things that we've got to struggle with as a control board and management team, and we will certainly be, proposing solutions here by December, is what level of T can we afford? I think the good news is that people love public transportation. The trains are more full than they've ever been. The subway is more full than it's ever been. And I think when you look at the real estate market and you look at listings and things, one of the first things you'll always see is walking distance to an MBTA stop. So I think there's a real opportunity here, frankly, on the development side to continue to drive development around the transit station. But we definitely have to do a better job with the product, and the service has got to work.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Chris, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
From the MBTA, Brian Shortsleeve. In a moment, we'll tell you about a family festival in South Boston.